Welcome to another edition of Anglican Unscripted. This is episode 104, and you're in front of your computer or your television watching two guys talk about the vast globe we call the Anglican Communion. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger, and today is July 14th, 2014.
George, I want to dedicate this segment to Forward in Faith. Forward in Faith, well, let's give our viewers a quick background. Tell us what Forward in Faith is and who it is.
Forward in Faith is, in the United States, it's the modern iteration of the Episcopal Synod of America, which started off as a coalition of evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics, but in the last 10, 15 years has become predominantly an Anglo-Catholic traditionalist organization. Mm-hmm. It's pretty much gone from the Episcopal Church, but it is very strong and vibrant part of the Anglican Church in North America. And it is part of an international coalition of Forward in Faith chapters spread across the globe, Africa, Europe, Australia.
So why on earth would we be talking about Forward in Faith? Well, they've been in the news a lot the last 2 weeks, and I think it's really important that we put this all into perspective. And we're going to start with the bad news of Forward in Faith and end with the good news of Forward in Faith. Forward in Faith is actually, or at one point was active in Africa, George, but they're succumbing to financial influences.
Yeah, the traditionalist Anglo-Catholic provinces of Africa, which are South Africa, Tanzania, Central Africa, and Ghana in West Africa, they were all evangelized by the old USPG. Now, that mission society is now called US, mm-hmm. And it is very much firmly in the affirming Catholicism camp. And Anglo-Catholicism in South Africa and is dead. It is purely affirming Catholicism. And while the Central Africans recently rejected the ordination of women, in international forums, they march in lockstep with the Episcopal Church, as does the Archbishop of Tanzania. And where does the money come to do all this? Well, essentially they do their own things at home, but in an international forums, they toe the American line. So Anglo-Catholicism in Africa, save for pockets like Zanzibar and the old UMCA diocese of Universities Missions of Central
Sure.
Africa diocese in East Africa, it's in real trouble.
Well, we just introduced a term that we need to define here. We use the term affirming Catholic. And, affirming Catholic obviously believes in all Catholic doctrine. No, they like the liturgy. I think of like Rowan Williams as an affirming Catholic, Frank Griswold, those liberal professor types who...
Well, the unkind cut about affirming Catholicism, yes, that an old crusty Anglo-Catholic will tell you is they're the ones that are for boys in the bed and girls at the altar. Affirming Catholicism is Frank Griswold, Rowan Williams, and other modern exponents of a Catholic liturgical system, mm-hmm. but a progressive doctrinal system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we understand that Africa is succumbing to the bunny influences and has lost its focus. There's Forward in Faith Australia, which we reported on last week, because Australia, the Church of Australia, has decided to remove the seal from the sacrament of the confession. Now, many in the Anglican Church don't believe that confession is a sacrament, but we'll leave that beside the point. It's kind of big because Forward in Faith Australia agreed with the removal of the seal between the penitent and the priest.
Yes, now individuals in Forward in Faith in Australia may not agree, mm-hmm. but the Anglo-Catholic deputies and bishops in the General Assembly all voted for it. The Australian Church now has a canon saying that if you confess something to your priest and you tell him you've molested a child or robbed a bank or murdered your mother-in-law, he will say to you, look, unless you go to the police, I'm going to go to the police for them. They've essentially adopted an Erastian point of view of the priest being an arm of the state. Mm-hmm. Now, for some people, God is the state, but that's not the traditional Anglo-Catholic understanding. But the Anglo-Catholics in Australia went along with this new way of thinking.
And that made quite a bit of news on the blogs the last 10 days. Now,
Mhm.
we also reported this week on Anglican Inc. that there's been trouble in Forward in Faith UK. We reported that one of the leaders in Forward in Faith UK had attended a gay pride parade, that it seems that the agenda of Forward in Faith has lost its Anglo-Catholic women's ordination issue and its same-sex marriage issues.
Right now, we're seeing the collapse of the Evangelical Anglo-Catholic Coalition in the UK. Not all members of Forward of Faith are pro-gay, pro-women's clergy. Far from it. But there are worrying signs. The leader, the chairman, Bishop Jonathan Baker of Fulham, who's one of the flying bishops, went along with the Pilling Report and is backing rethinking the Church of England's understanding of gay marriage. The bishops of Forward in Faith have declined to take a firm stance on the gay issue. They just say, oh, we need to pray and discuss it. Whereas the Forward in Faith in the U.S. says, here's what the church teaches, here's what the Bible teaches, here's what our tradition teaches. The answer is no. You don't get that from Forward in Faith UK bishops.
Well,
And their magazine just came out with a pro-gay marriage article.
Well, right now in the UK, it's 9:53 a.m. Eastern Time Monday. They are debating, as of this very moment, women's ordination or to the episcopate. And so women bishops has been a topic now for almost 2 years in the Church of England, well, probably longer. A staunch proponent of women's ordination and women's ordination to the episcopate has always been Forward in Faith. They're no longer the enemy of women's ordination or women bishops, George.
Well, yes, they've been an opponent for many years, but now they're going along to get along. And the thinking is that they can create their own little ghetto and do their own little thing in this corner. But the problem that Forward in Faith has as a long-term institution in a ghetto is that the archbishops of York and Canterbury will be ordaining women bishops. And that means that any future Forward in Faith bishop or Anglo-Catholic flying bishop will be consecrated by a bishop who lays hands on women clergy. And they don't accept that right now. So they're going to, and that's been one of their sticking points, that they will not, if you will, have hands laid on them by a bishop whose hands have been sullied by laying them onto a woman's priest's head. Now they've basically agreed to give up on that position. How can they maintain their integrity, of their theological integrity, once? Now, whether you agree with them or not is a different issue. But it's rather the issue that I'm talking about is the theological logic of their position. They've agreed to roll over. And that really spells the end of Forward in Faith as a traditionalist Anglo-Catholic institution.
However, in America, things are much different. I just attended a Forward in Faith USA event that was held in Belleville, Illinois at the Lady of the Snow Shrine. And I got to tell you, these people are vibrant, alive, and virtually, and I've attended this for about 5 years in a row, they don't seem unchanged. They do seem a little disturbed by what's been happening in the international news. They admit that Australia has been lost, that the UK is taking a road which they cannot follow. But that's not stopping them from being the Anglo-Catholics that they truly desire to be. They're starting to do some work in India and other places, and it's interesting to watch a real working Forward in Faith versus what we read about in the news.
Now, I think I'd like the luxury of making a personal statement. I am not an Anglo-Catholic. I do not share many of their theological issues, but I see them as a valued, essential part of the Anglican tradition and way. And though I may not agree on their hot-button issues with them, I think it is vital that they preserve their integrity. Because if they don't preserve their integrity, how am I going to be able to preserve mine in the future fights for the church?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Forward in Faith is a vibrant part of the ACNA, and you always look for people who are stowards, people who always carry on and are unfazed by what goes on around them, and that's always been Forward in Faith for the many years that I've known them. They've always carried their banner and have proclaimed Christ the Savior as I know Him. I am not Anglo-Catholic either, but man, I can't imagine the ACNA or Anglicanism without them. It's just one of those things. Now, boy, you need to keep these guys in your prayers because it seems the weaker branches of the church have fallen off the tree, George. We're going to do a report on a former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, who's been in the news recently by an article he penned. It was for the Daily Mail.
Saturday in the Daily Mail.
And before I get there, I want to talk about a gentleman here in America named Jack Kevorkian. Jack Kevorkian was known and pretty famous in the mid-90s for coming up with a concoction that could end the life of people peacefully who were suffering great pain, end-of-life terminal illnesses. And over the course of several years, he had a van that would travel around, and he managed to off about 50 people. And 60 Minutes said, hey, we need to do a report on this. This guy's doing a wonderful work in the world, and we need this to be a global thing. When they did this report, they started to investigate the people that had approached Jack Kevorkian about ending their life. And they discovered most of them did not have terminal illnesses, but the most common cause and illness they all had was mental illness and severe depression, which Jack never looked into. And all of a sudden, journalists who were pro-euthanasia got all freaked out. This wasn't supposed to happen. This is only supposed to be applied to the people who are the last desperate breaths, last gasp of their lives. How on earth are we letting this happen? Now, until that point, they were pro-euthanasia because in our brains it makes sense. It makes sense that we don't want people to suffer. Nobody wants grandma to suffer in pain with bone cancer, dying on a bed. But in as such, I always have to ask myself, and as a whole, Jesus suffered on a cross. Would we have cheated Jesus and ourselves by ending his life early on the cross by giving him end-of-life drugs because we didn't want to watch his suffering? And would death still have no sting if he died at our hands and not the hands of the cross? And boy, George, this is a real big piece we look at, and I want to talk to you quickly here as a journalist because you've been through pain that I've not been through.
Well, I do have need to make a personal
Sure.
reference that I was a hospice chaplain for 5 years, and I dealt every day with people in excruciating pain who had less than 6 months to live. I also, at one point in my life, was very ill, and I had that sort of excruciating pain that cannot be treated by medicine. Yet, I never once have doubted that every human being's life has value, inherent intrinsic dignity. And to kill inconvenient people, whether you think you're doing it out of compassion or whether you think you're doing it for their best interests, is just evil. If you look at the practical levels, Holland was one of the first countries to legalize euthanasia and was going to be very rare and very rigorous in its application. Now they're killing about 6,000 people a year. And many of these people, government has found, did not consent to their being euthanized. Mm-hmm. They were just killed because they were an inconvenience to the family or to the state. That is murder. And the logic this twisted logic of compassion that, well, I'm going to put so-and-so out of their suffering. Like people are like a horse with a broken leg and we should kill them because we can't care for them. That's wrong. It is so wrong. And I speak out of personal experiences, both a person who has cared for these people for a good portion of my ministry and as a person who suffered for a very brief time with that sort of pain.
Well, now
It's a terrible thing that is being done.
let's get back to Archbishop George Carey. We never said what he said in the Daily Mail. George Carey came out in favor of euthanasia. He said, "I've changed my mind. I no longer think the way I used to think." And for a long time, George Carey has been, the Orthodox Anglican Archbishop we all used to love. Don't you remember how cool it was when George Carey was Archbishop? All was well in the world. He would certainly put his finger on international politics and stop what was, causing the Anglican community to sway off its access. And he was just the best thing, we've ever had in the last century for Anglicanism. But this is a big step off the porch. He's taking a step further that I can go, and I think it's so easy to use their mind to say, suffering is not what God would want. Well, I do, but I saw his son suffer I didn't get to see it. I heard of his son suffering on a cross for more than half a day. I understand that suffering is a natural part of the human condition, and it's a part of our lives as Christians. But I think George is taking a step too far, George.